Because when Omri made an alliance with the Phoenicians, he married his son. Remember, alliance is made through marriage. He marries his son, Ahab, to a Phoenician princess, the daughter of Tyre, whose name, and you've probably heard this name. If you know nothing else about biblical history, you've probably heard this name. Does anyone know the name of the Phoenician princess that Ahab married? Jezebel. Now, I used to teach in the South. I did 5 years teaching in Missouri and just about 4 or 5 years teaching in Kentucky. And down south, the idea of a Jezebel has a very distinct meaning. And it's very interesting to see the way it relates to the portrayal of Jezebel in the Bible. What does it mean when you call somebody a Jezebel? Anybody know? Does that at all reach up into the north here? Huh? Okay, flirts a lot, fools around a lot. Anything else? What? Yeah. Well, no, those are two different streams of it. Those are two different threads. We have the idea of somebody sexually loose, and we have the idea of, you said, a devil, almost like a demonic force. And both of those mythic ideas have been connected with the name Jezebel. So you get an idea of how she might be portrayed in the Bible. She's not, well, yeah, she is kind of a vicious woman. But mostly she's condemned because she takes it upon herself to convert the entire people of the northern kingdom to the worship of her national God. So rather than worshiping Yahweh, the national God of Israel, she wants them to worship Baal. You will sometimes hear this pronounced just as a single syllable, Baal. It's just a matter of what you've gotten used to. And in my graduate school, we always pronounced it Baal, so you'll just get used to that. Okay, she wanted them all to convert to the worship of Baal, and she appears to have been a very strong-minded woman and very much able to dominate the very weak and unsympathetically drawn Ahab. I mean, when you start reading the stories of Ahab, you generate nothing but contempt for him. And so she was able to manipulate him. And it caused a grand confrontation because almost can't help talking about it a little bit. But remember, the royalty in the north and the south has now become a very urbanized, a very citified phenomenon. The kings live in the city, and their culture is very cosmopolitan. They have constant contact with other cultures. But there's a whole village and town culture that almost is independent of this. And this prophet comes out of the desert almost, and his name is Elijah. And sometimes I almost think it's a title and not a name, because El is the Hebrew word for God, and the I over here, the Eli is the way it's pronounced, means my God, and then Yah is, you supply Yahweh. So Elijah's name is almost a challenge. Well, you say our God is Baal, well, I'm saying our God is Yahweh. And he comes out of the woods and appears before the royal family, and he says, it's not going to rain until I say so, and just runs away. And that's really ironic, because Baal is understood by the Phoenicians as being the storm god, the giver of rain. So here it is, a prophet of Yahweh comes in and says, Baal doesn't control the rain, I do. And it's not going to rain anymore. I don't care what you or your priests of Baal do. So he runs away, and sure enough, a terrible drought for 3 years. The people are dying like flies. And then Elijah comes back, and this is in 1 Kings chapter 18 for your later reference. Elijah comes back, and he challenges the prophets of Baal. He says, meet me tomorrow at noon on Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is this mountain that rises up out of the sea on the coast of northern Israel, and it's always been a place of a shrine. So it not only juts out but goes up. It's a fairly, for Israel, it's a fairly high elevation. The Carmelites had their first house on Mount Carmel, which is why they're called Carmelites. Anyway, Elijah and the prophets of Baal meet on Mount Carmel, and Elijah challenges them to a duel. I mean, a prophetic duel. He says, set up an altar, and I'll set up an altar. We'll have these two altars there. Now, we'll each take an ox, and we'll slaughter the ox, and we'll place the pieces of the ox on the top of this altar. By altar here, they mean kind of a raised stone platform with certain ornamentation. So they each put the ox on the altar. And then Elijah says, we'll take turns calling on our God from heaven. And whichever God can light and burn and consume the sacrifice, well, that'll be the true God. So the prophets of Baal accept that. I mean, after all, Baal is a storm god. And storm gods, lightning, you know, it'd be really easy for Baal to do that. So they have the contest, and Elijah says, you go first. And they cry, and they dance, and they say their incantations, and nothing happens, and Elijah starts to make fun of them. He starts to say, shout a little louder, maybe God doesn't hear you, maybe he's hard of hearing, maybe he stepped out for a moment, why don't you wait to find out when he's going to come back? Look for him, maybe he's lost. And just saying all these nasty things, and they get so upset, they pull out the big guns. They gash their arms with stones until the blood flows, because the blood somehow empowered and strengthened and intensified their incantations. They work themselves up into a frenzy, and still, cloudless sky. Remember, there was a drought, and there was a drought for 3 years, and these prophets couldn't pull the rain in. So the sky is sunny, not a cloud in the sky. Then it's Elijah's turn. He makes a long public prayer and waits. And a cloud comes, and then more clouds come together. And then not only is the sacrifice burned, but Elijah had poured barrels of water over the sacrifice, and all that water is consumed. The people, having received evidence that Yahweh is more powerful than Baal, they say, Yahweh is God, Yahweh is God, and Elijah says, kill all the prophets of Baal, and hundreds of prophets are killed that day. So this confrontation goes on for a while until, and I'm going to sandwich a lot of time now, because I want to get to where this instability changes, because the dynasties just keep changing. Omri is succeeded by Ahab. Ahab is succeeded by his son Jehoram, and I'm not even going to put that down here. Jehoram is murdered by a guy named Jehu, who starts a whole new dynasty, and Jehu has a son, and Jehu has a grandson, and now we come on to the period of time I want us to slow down a bit. Okay? So what we have here is one more change of dynasty. This one goes on a little bit more, and then the new dynasty with Jehu. Now that's the internal development of the northern kingdom with regard to their kings and how it developed. And they never really had a lock on the monarchy. They never really had a sense. They always were tempted to go their own way. And interestingly enough, they had two movements which were always in conflict in the north. One that was always trying to draw them back to a kind of pure Yahwism, Eliyahu, Elijah, my God is Yahweh. And then there was another movement in the north that was always trying to pull them to say what we would call syncretism. They're really just the same thing. Yahwism, Baalism, it's really the same. We believe in the same God, just different names. And in fact, there's some truth to that, because Baal is simply the Hebrew word which means Lord or husband. So they have called Yahweh their Lord and their husband many times. This is just a perfectly good variant Hebrew word for that. So maybe Baal is just another title for Yahweh. And this opens the Israelites up to all kinds of influenced by the other cultures. And so these two movements are always fighting with each other. Okay, I'm going to stop now and say and ask, are there any questions? Is there anything you want me to, Beth?
Did you mean Beersheba to be Bethel?
Dan and Bethel, thank you. Beersheba's way down here. A terrible mistake. I appreciate you pointing that out. Dan and Bethel. And the only reason it is important is because Bethel becomes the chief sanctuary, and there's a lot of references to Bethel, and after the test we'll be doing some stuff that'll take place around Bethel with the various kings. Other questions? Amy?
So what were you saying about that syncretism? What were the two conflicts, the syncretism
and the purists? I call them people like Elijah and his disciples, and there was another one. We're not going to talk about Elisha, who succeeded after Elijah. I call them the radical Yahwehs. Because what they feel is, if you're not going to worship Yahweh, then we'll kill you. I mean, it comes down to that. Anybody, you would not believe some of the bloodthirsty descriptions, the really gleeful descriptions of the torturing and murder of Baal worshippers. There's one story about, I wasn't going to tell this, but it's one of those juicy ones. There's one story about Jehu, that after he became king in the north, after he had killed Jehoram, the king, after he had killed Jezebel, who was still alive, she was the queen mother, he had Jezebel thrown out of a second-story window, and then he rode back and forth over her with his chariots until she was kind of mushy. And then he went inside and had a meal. And when he came out, all that was left of her were the palms of her hands and the soles of her feet, and the dogs had eaten everything else. I mean, there was a really gleeful description of the destruction of this woman. It'll curdle your stomach. Anyway, after Jehu does all that, and after he establishes himself as king of Israel, he makes this vast announcement. The announcement is Ahab and Joram and Jezebel, well, they worship Baal a little, but I worship Baal a lot. And he announced a big festival to Baal, invited all the worshipers to come to one of these big temples. He brought all the worshipers in, he brought the sacrifices in, he made an announcement, walked out, had his soldiers lock the door, and set the place on fire, and instruct his chief archers to kill anybody that makes it out. And real grisly stuff. I heard, when I was teaching the course on the Holocaust over Jan term, I heard identical stories of things Nazis did. This was a very, very unpleasant period in Israel's history. I mean, but these are the radical Yahwists. They will kill anybody who doesn't agree with them. Then there are these syncretists. Probably the people usually working in the temple guilds, and the people who were supporters of the kings, and they would be much more open to compromise, to learning about other cultures, to exploring the similarities between the cultures. These were the two groups in the north. Other questions? Okay, let's again move our perspective into foreign policy. Do you see the rhythm of what I'm doing? I go internal policy, foreign policy, internal policy, foreign policy, because they're related in some very complex ways. Because interestingly enough, Jehu's grandson, whose name I will not write on because I don't want you to remember because it'll confuse you terribly. I'll tell you once, and then I'm only going to call him Jehu's grandson, is Jeroboam II. And they don't call him two in the Bible. They just say Jeroboam, and you've got to just keep track. Well, is it the first Jeroboam or is it the second one? And it's two different people. Anyway, his grandson made alliances with the southern king in Jerusalem, and between the two of them, they established a very stable period in the history of the region. Interestingly enough, another decline at that point of Egypt.